had this experience, but I had it, where you go away to college or you move away somewhere and you feel like you've changed. You've evolved, you've grown, you have a new perspective of the world, and then you come back and then you have an expectation that your family is going to see you for who you are now. Has anyone been there? I remember going to college, right? I took like at least an entire semester of school. I'm a radically transformed 18-year-old. I have had a liberal arts education at the Harvard of the West, Azusa Pacific University. My mind, my soul has been changed. And so now I have come home to show my parents the truth in this world that they basically know nothing because they're a bunch of idiots from Colorado, right? I'm in Los Angeles. I'm surrounded by creatives, by liberals, by elite, brilliant people. They live in the Rocky Mountains. What are they doing? Eating elk or something stupid, right? Anyone ever leave home and have that feeling? I am now smarter than all of them. I am now better than all of you. You can be honest in here right now. I'm being honest, right? A little bit. I had that feeling again. We just went to Wisconsin to see my wife's family, and I noticed the grief in myself as I went to go visit my wife's family. Part of it is there's a grief because I don't have family anymore. I don't have a relationship with my parents anymore. My sister is dead. All of my aunts and uncles. This is not like a boohoo moment. It's just real. And part of that is my journey of New Abbey. Part of that is my journey with a conservative Christian family. Part of that is a journey of a cousin texting me in the middle of the night, just reminding me that because I love gay people, that I'm sending people to Second Lake of Fire. It's a conversation when my aunt's dying. She's a sweet woman, asking if I would have permission to come next to her bed as she passed away, just to say my goodbyes. And no, because I'm a heretic. I know what it's like to lose things. I know what it's like to stand for what you believe. And so when I go and see my wife's family, I think I carry that with me. And there's a little part of me that's not it's 20-some years later after the 18-year-old went home to Colorado to let everyone know how much smarter he was than everyone else. That didn't work, by the way. Now I have a little bit more tools in the tool bag, but there's still a part of me that wants to be seen, that wants to be known, that wants to be able to have robust conversations that I can't have. My in-laws will never ask me about this church. They'll never ask me what's going on. And that pains me. I don't know if you've been there. That there's a part of you that you want to share with the people that you love the most, and you want them to know you because you're good and it's good, but you can't tell them anything about it. And I bet it's painful. I know for my queer brothers and sisters in this room, so many of you have come out, and there's family. You just long that they could know all of you. Some have, lots haven't, and it's painful. I know for my creative brothers and sisters in this room, you came to LA because you left that town and you had a story to tell, something unique and something different, and you've gone back and you just want to be seen for who you've become, not who you were. You've evolved, you've grown, you've changed. And then sometimes you go back and you feel like, but that hasn't changed. That's a little bit of what we're talking about today. I think that word, that thing, is called wisdom. I didn't have wisdom as an 18-year-old. I didn't have a frontal lobe as an 18-year-old, so wisdom would have been a real shocker. My wife smiled because she knows she met me, and you married me, so joke's on you. Didn't have a frontal lobe for a long time. I think wisdom is this gift in which we begin to take on our experiences and have different tools. We become more sophisticated. We begin to have space. We begin to have distance. We can see some things. We don't have to make all of our own mistakes in order for us to learn some stuff. Wisdom is this thing I think that Jesus is inviting us into all of the time. I think as a young evangelical, I'm not saying this is evangelicalism, I'm just saying this was my perception of evangelicalism. I wasn't always given wisdom. I was given information. I was given knowledge. I was given Bible verses to memorize. That's not the same thing as wisdom and transformation. Wisdom and transformation are a journey that you go to grow up and to figure things out. A lot of what I was told was just my high school version of self. How far is too far? That's the knowledge I was given, but not the wisdom for what it means to become a human being. And what I love about Jesus is that when I look at Jesus honestly now at this point in my life, I see that Jesus is just constantly inviting us to follow him into a path of wisdom. You'll notice that when you read Jesus, when you see the life of Jesus, Jesus isn't as black and white as I was told when I was growing up. Jesus is very interested in a lot of things that I'm interested in, and Jesus is very uninterested in some of the things I'm interested in. Jesus is very interested in our development. Jesus is very interested in our healing, in our figuring it out, in us letting go of some structures that aren't helpful for us and finding structures that are. Jesus is interested in our transformation. Interestingly enough, things that Jesus never talks about, you going to hell, there being a rapture, there being all of these things where you're being judged in a certain way. Jesus is just uninterested in talking about those things. Jesus talks about sin, by the way. He doesn't talk about sin how we heard it, where there's like a magical game of chess that you're playing with God, where God made all of the rules, and it feels like God's just a little bit sadistic to see if you can do it or not. Some of you are smiling because you know that God. Thank you. Instead, it's a God who's like, oh, no. Sin's a real conversation. It's a conversation about the palpable disruption of shalom. It's a conversation about hurt people hurting people. Jesus is very interested in that. Jesus is so aware that the individual systems, all the way to the big giant systems in our world, participate in sin in a way when we participate in hurt or wounding other people's wholeness. And Jesus is also very aware that when we're hurt and then when we're wounded, we tend to go wound and hurt other people. Thus the story of the cross. It's not a story about God magically taking away the sin. It's about Jesus inviting us into a world where we're transformed in our pain so that we no longer transmit it. I repeat these things here again and again and again because I think for so many of us, we have so much rewiring to do about Jesus. And where I want to take us is to a Jesus that actually is just very interested in us learning wisdom. And Jesus is okay with that slow journey and that slow path of finding wisdom. And then what I like about Jesus is when I see a lot of Jesus' stories, they look similar, universal, archetypal to, I think, just the human experience for all of us. So to talk about wisdom today, we're going to talk about some things. We're going to talk about the stories we tell. If we can talk about the stories we tell, then we can talk about WNBA phenoms Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese, my friends. And if we can talk about Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese, then we can talk about some boundaries. And if we can talk about some boundaries, then maybe we could be freed from the reality that you have nothing to prove. And if you can realize that you have nothing to prove, then, like 2000 Super Soul Sunday, Oprah, Eckhart Tolle. If we can do a little bit of Eckhart Tolle, then we'll talk about what it means to be generous. And then we'll just end with a little bit of self-help, if you're okay with that, and some Tony Robbins. Follow along with me in Mark chapter 6. Jesus left a part of the country. Are we in the same one? We're in that. Nice. And returned with his disciples to Nazareth, his hometown. Jesus was out and about doing Jesus things before he went back to his hometown. He was just in a village where a woman was bleeding for 12 years, and he healed her. There was a little girl who had died. He had raised her from the dead. Before that, Jesus was in an area of a militarized zone in Palestine where Jesus freed a man with a legion of demons, right? Jesus just calmed a storm before that. Jesus has done some stuff. Even before that, it said that everywhere that Jesus went, he healed people. He shared good news. The Jesus who's coming back home is probably very different than the Jesus that they remember. Jesus has the same story as us. Jesus has just done some amazing things in the world. Who Jesus is. I know sometimes we don't always think about Jesus as this human, but I think it's helpful. Jesus is back in his hometown, just like you go back. You left, you came to Los Angeles, you did your stuff, you're doing incredible things in the world. You have gone to therapy, my friends. You have read 2.5 Brené Brown books. You're doing it. You have podcasts that sometimes you finish, and they are making you better. All a joke, but also all real. You are transforming, and you are evolving, and you are not the same person anymore. But sometimes you got to go home. And that's where the stuff gets a little bit tested. And the next Sabbath, he began teaching in the synagogue. He's back at his home church. Talk about a good time. And many who heard him were amazed. But then they asked themselves, Where did he get all this wisdom and the power to perform such miracles? They scoffed. He's just a carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James, and Joseph, and Judas, and Simon, and his sisters live right here among us. And they were deeply offended and refused to believe in him. Same story as any of us. He left home, he evolved, he grew, he's different than what they remembered, but they still remember the kid who left home. That's a painful point for all of us when we want to be seen as something else. And then Jesus told them, a prophet is honored everywhere except in his own hometown and among his relatives and his own family. Because of their unbelief, he couldn't do any miracles among them except to place his hands on a few sick people and heal them. And he was amazed at their unbelief. What I love about this story is I think it's just our story. I think it's a story that all of us go through. I think what's helpful about Jesus is that Jesus is both archetypal and a prototype. Archetypal in the reality that the story of Jesus is just universal. Every single human being goes through this journey at some point. You just leave home at some point, and you have to come back to a home, whatever that means and that looks like, and often that journey is just painful. That's just real. It's not that complicated. We've all experienced it. We've seen it. There's just growing pains to that reality. Jesus is also a prototype in the reality that Jesus is doing new things for us to show us a different way about how we can be human, a way that shows us the fullness of God and the way that shows us the fullness of ourselves. Jesus is offering us that wisdom. So I want to look at 4 tools this morning that just simply help us in the wisdom journey of how we tell our stories. What I love about this is that Jesus is constantly the person. How he tells his story is he shows you, he doesn't tell you. The 18-year-old version of me was so obnoxious. I am an Enneagram. My wife just nodded her head. That was just perfect. Eye contact, right moment. Thank you for not saying amen out loud. That was incredible. I'm an Enneagram 3 extrovert. My processing in the world is I'm obnoxious. Some of you are Enneagram 5 introverts. Your processing of your world is you wouldn't be obnoxious. You might sit inside having an expectation that your family is going to accept everything about you, even though they've had no time to process it with you, and now you have a bunch of resentments. I bet you we cover a lot of area between that spectrum of how we relate as human beings. And what Jesus does is that Jesus doesn't go around and smiting the entire town for not seeing who he is now. It says that Jesus couldn't perform certain miracles. It's not like the magic ran out. It's just one of those realities of sometimes you go to places and they're not ready for what you have, and that's just okay. And you have a choice. You can be super obnoxious and try to go over the top and try to get bigger than them and make sure that they really understand how changed you are. Does not work. You could be super in your head and be super resentful and be really mad at these people, and they have no idea that you are, but you think that they should know, and because they don't know, it makes you more resentful of what they ought to know that they had to know about you. Nobody. Okay, I'm just saying, you know somebody. And I think what Jesus does is Jesus just constantly is in the game of how he shares the stories Jesus shows us. Everywhere that Jesus goes, he heals people. Everywhere that Jesus goes, he makes people around them better. And Jesus does it even in his own hometown. Even when nobody else, the very people that Jesus probably wanted most to see who he was now, are not going to see him that way. He's just constant in his mission. However Jesus would describe himself in one sentence, right? Jesus is constant in his mission for the kingdom of God. Maybe a more practical way of saying that, Jesus is constant in his mission for this reality that he sees of bringing heaven to earth. Jesus is constant in his mission about healing people. Jesus is constant in his mission to make sure that you may have life and life to the fullest. Jesus is constant in those things, regardless of the stories that everyone else around him is saying about him. Jesus is constant in his mission about the story that he's saying about himself. And he doesn't even have to tell you. He didn't walk back into the synagogue when they were unbelieving and he's like, remember the dead girl? No longer dead. Me, right? Remember the storms that were going on and I just spoke and they stopped? Me. He doesn't do anything like that. He just lets it be. And we have the ability to tell our own stories in a different way. And I think part of the freedom that we gain as we not only heal, but as we transform and eventually mature, is we don't have to tell everyone our stories all the time. We just get to be ourselves. We get to show people instead of tell people. I think the first tool of wisdom that we take in is, what are the stories that we're telling people? Are you telling people your story in a helpful way, out of the natural outflow of goodness that's happening in your life? Or are you telling people who you are because you need to incessantly make sure that they cross every I, right, every T, and dot every I that you do about how you understand your life? And only you can decide that. But you know these people in your life when they're relentless towards you. So maybe you can understand how you're being relentless towards others, and you can find yourself some freedom that you don't have to keep telling your story in that way. Just keep doing you. Your hometown might not want it, might not need it, might not accept it. That doesn't mean that you can't keep pulling off the magic that you are in the world, what you have to offer to so many others. And could you be okay with that? I love Caitlin Clark, and I love Angel Reese, and I love what's happening in the WNBA this year. In full disclosure, I have not watched a lot of WNBA in like 15 years before this. I love what's going on because I just love stories in sports. I love when there's a catalyst, when there's a lightning in the bottle kind of moment where everybody kind of has this like, whoa, what's happening here? And that's what's happening right now in this moment. You have these two women who are playing incredible basketball as rookies, and you went from stadiums being a third full to packed out, which at the end of the day is good for capitalism in that version of it. It's good for these women being paid more and what they deserve. It's all a good thing that they are creating a story that's impacting other people. And what I love about both of them is they're not like mouthy in how they're doing it. Every single time they set a new record, which is like every night, by the way, when you see their interviews, I show my kids these interviews about this is what kind of leader you can be. Caitlin Clark broke the record for the most triple doubles and the most assists the other night. And they talked to her about that. And all that she would say is, man, isn't it amazing that every time I gave them my assist, my teammate would score? She was always just showing through her attitude that she was making other people better around her. That's what I'm interested in. She hasn't sat around and pouted about the reality that she didn't make Team USA, even though her and Angel Reese beat Team USA last night in the WNBA All-Star game. And they're still not invited to it. But did they talk about that in the postgame? No, they just talked about making everybody else better around them. They could have sat out there and proved to the world, we're better players than this, or whatever this means. They could have been resentful. They could have been obnoxious. Instead, they're just showing people with their actions a better narrative and a better story, and that is compelling. After we learn to tell our stories in a different way, I think another tool of wisdom that we have is boundaries. If you come to New Abbey long enough, we've talked about boundaries a million different times. Boundaries are helpful because they allow you to limit what other people's voices are telling you, and boundaries are helpful that you have boundaries about what you're going to go do in the world. What I love about the story of Jesus here is that he has boundaries. He just has boundaries about what he's trying to do. He's not trying to convince everybody in his hometown that he's the new Messiah, the Son of God, Son of Man, look at me, come on out. Jesus is just doing his thing. And I think it's always a question for us, are we making appropriate boundaries in our life with the people around us? You can't convince them. You might not ever be able to convince them of who you are now. And more importantly than that, you don't have to let their voices shape who you are. I remember going home when I was a 20-something. And every time that I would go home as a 20-something, I would allow the voices of my family to shape who I was. Because I desperately needed their approval. I desperately needed them to accept me. And it took years to finally accept that I'm accepted. I don't know where you're at in your journey, but would you accept that you're accepted? Would you put some boundaries in place in your life that you don't need their approval? That I think for all of us, it's already hard enough figuring this thing out on our own, let alone allowing everyone else's voices to be inside of us. Listen to this quote from Eckhart Tolle. Every complaint is a little story the mind makes up that you completely believe in. I think some of what we do is we put boundaries within ourselves. We put boundaries within ourselves about the little complaints that we're making up about everyone else because it's just little stories that we eventually believe in. that it's one thing to make boundaries about everyone else around you. And sometimes you're going to look back on that with 2020 vision, and it's going to have worked, and it's not going to have worked. But the real challenge is, can we put boundaries within ourselves, that I don't have to accept every little voice that comes in my head. Feelings are beautiful and radical and good. They're not always true, but they are always telling you something. And you analyze those, and you place boundaries in place, that just because I'm feeling that way today doesn't mean that I have to go way over here or way over here. I learn in wisdom to analyze those feelings and to shape my life. Some of the tools that we learn in wisdom is, what are the stories that we tell ourselves? Are we putting boundaries up in our lives? And then the third tool for us is, you have nothing to prove. I say this because I've had a lot of coffees and a lot of beers in this room, and I've lived my own life. I know what it's like to feel like you have something to prove. You may never prove to your parents. I may never prove to my family that whatever, the word gay is not in the Bible. Anyone ever just like debated your family endlessly and like going through the nuances of Romans and the Greek, and you show them 16 videos and they're still like, well, that's just not what the word of the Lord says. Anyone been there? It's not helpful. You don't have to prove anything. And I think one of the freedoms that I have in this world is, I spent the first 6 years of New Abbey trying to prove everything to everybody. I would read every book and read every commentary and know what was going out and make sure I understood the theological terms. I'm pretty good at Greek. I'm pretty good at Hebrew. I would do all of this stuff until I realized I have nothing to prove to you. Do you want me to prove New Abbey to you? Go and have a conversation with every single one of these people and let the fruit of their lives speak for themselves. You all are showing them so that I don't have to tell them, so to speak, and vice versa in my own life. That's the magic about this community. We have nothing to prove to anybody. All we get to do is to keep living our lives and keep telling the stories that we want to tell. We get to keep putting appropriate boundaries in our life where we limit our own limiting voices and we limit the limiting voices of other people. Where we live in the freedom that we have nothing to prove to anybody, that we're already accepted exactly where we're at. I'm going to end with a little Tony Robbins for you because I'm in a little self-help mood at the moment. Tony Robbins says this: what we can or cannot do, what we consider possible or impossible, is rarely a function of our true capability. It is more likely a function of our beliefs about who we are. One of the things that I've learned over the years, one of the things that I think I was processing a lot as I was in Wisconsin is, full disclosure, I want everyone to be generous to me and I don't want to be generous to everybody else. Anybody there? Is that just fair? I want everyone to accept and see me for who I am. I want them to completely accept the realities that I was in Wisconsin during the Republican National Convention, people. Needless to say, I had a different viewpoint than a lot of the people that I was around. And what I selfishly want in the world is, when I vote, or when I talk about Jesus, when I talk about my evolution, or when I talk about my life, what I'm really saying is, I want you to see the world as I see it. If I'm being honest with myself. I think wisdom is just being generous. You're not in the same place as me, and I'm not in the same place as you. Do I take seriously the words of our unity prayer that we say at the beginning of every gathering? That you're just different than me, that you're still God's child, and that God still loves you, and that God's still pleased with you. And as I end every single time with that prayer, those are easy words to say and incredibly difficult words to live out. They're tough to live out when you go to Milwaukee in the middle of a Republican National Convention. They're tough to live out sometimes when you have to go home for Thanksgiving. They're tough to go out when for some reason you decided to go on Facebook today and look in a comment section. Why? Facebook of all places. It's incredible to live out when other people are just different than you. And again, what I love about Jesus and what I love about Jesus' generosity in this story is he doesn't go around judging the place, burning it down, smiting them, proving who he is, doing any of that stuff. He heals a few and he just moves on. Maybe that's the freedom that you need. You have nothing to prove. You can be generous. You can set appropriate boundaries in your life. And when you hold those tools of wisdom, then you can begin to tell a different story about yourself and what you're doing in this world. Would you find those same 3 or 4 people around you? Would you answer this question? How can wisdom shape the story you tell yourself?